I recently saw Supergirl. I saw it in 3D at the Regal Theater. This is sort of a spin-off of the Superman film. She was first introduced in Superman from last year, this version of the character at least. This is part of James Gunn's pseudo reboot of the DC franchise. This is something that I've been cautiously excited for. I'm not the biggest superhero nut. I got kind of over fatigued by how many things were coming out in that realm, but I liked most of what James Gunn has done, and I was very hopeful about the direction that he was taking this universe. He did not lead this project, but he was loosely involved with it. So this film starts off right off the bat in kind of a fun way. We're getting introduced to Supergirl and her dog. I actually really like the dynamic that she has with her dog. I was a little bit disappointed the dog is not in much of the film because I really wanted to see more of him. I would say the first hour, maybe hour and a half of this film is a lot of fun. In many ways, it is colorful, it's punchy. Unfortunately, the second half kind of gets just very messy plot wise. I don't necessarily mean like it's bad, just it's not very engaging. And our final battle kind of takes place in a very brown, generic kind of action sludge environment, which was typical of a lot of superhero films for quite some time, and I was kind of hoping that we were moving away from that. And in some ways we are, but in some ways it feels like superhero films are kind of still where they were at. So the film stars Millie Alcock. She gives a really good performance as Supergirl. I don't have any notes there. Our deuteragonist is a little girl. The actress gives a pretty good performance, but her character is just not very interesting. Once she becomes more and more ingrained in the plot is where it kind of started to lose me a little bit. This film has a bit of a character arc in it that tries to do the revenge is bad trope, which is always a little bit goofy when you're watching a superhero film, a martial arts film, an action film, where people are, at least they look like they're being killed left and right, but then all of a sudden, it's a bad thing that we're not supposed to do. So it's always a little risky when you try to do something like that. I do think this film largely pulled off what it was trying to do with that. I wouldn't say it's a resounding success in that regard, but it's definitely not a failure either. For a lot of the film, Supergirl doesn't have her powers. Obviously, when you have really overpowered characters, you need to find a way to nerf them. And for her, it's basically when she is in a part of the solar system with a part of the universe with a red sun, she doesn't have her powers that she would get from a yellow sun. So being in those areas, she can be drained of her powers, from my understanding. I'm not necessarily an expert on superhero lore. I was never into the comics, so I don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of how people's powers work, but the explanations that we got in this film work well enough for me. I did see some people saying that they did not like what this did to the source material. I'm not familiar with the source material at all, so I'm not going to comment on that. The story largely worked for me. It's really just the final act of the film where it kind of dived a little bit. The villain that we choose to focus on is just not really memorable at all. I don't even really have much to say about him because there's just not much to say about him. We do get some parts in the story which are origin pieces of her story back on Krypton and her growing up and how she ended up on Earth and how all this happened. That's where some of the true like emotional heart of this film is. Those were a lot of my personal favorite scenes outside of the opening, which I really liked. The film very liberally uses needle drops quite often throughout the film. I like these. They're a lot of fun. I think they work for these kind of generic action pieces that, it's just like a fun music video type vibe. It does use a lot of them. And I would agree with many people have said the needle drops in this film don't have the same kind of intent and emotional basis that they did in Superman. They're still fun to watch though, especially in 3D, which was the version that I saw. The big needle drop at the climax of this film has been a bit of a controversy among people. If you've seen the film, you definitely know what I'm talking about. I won't spoil what that needle drop is. I didn't hate it as much as other people do. It is certainly a choice, though. It is a very weird choice that took me out a little bit. It was not necessarily what I would have chosen for that particular scene. I saw the film in 3D. I didn't intentionally choose to see it in 3D. I wanted to spend a day at the theater. I was going to see four movies, and seeing this in 3D was the only way to make that work. There's some elements in this that are really neat to see in 3D. Obviously, a lot of it takes place in space. There's stuff flying at you. There's things coming through the scene. Those are all neat. They look cool. I wouldn't necessarily pay to go see this in 3D. I have Regal Unlimited, so it's just a $3 upcharge for me. If you were to pay a full ticket, I imagine it would probably not be worth this to see in 3D. See the original, sure, but I wouldn't personally pay to see 3D. There was one scene in 3D that I really liked where you see kind of like they're in space and like a tear's forming in a certain character's eye, and the tear like bubbles and comes at you. That was cool. That's really the only moment I think where the kind of emotionalness was elevated by the 3D version that I saw. There are some brief appearances of Superman in this film, so if that's what you're coming for, you do get some scenes with him. Nothing too crazy, but I think there's 2 or 3 scenes where he's a major part of, usually flashbacks. So the little girl's arc is about that kind of revenge, worth it or not tale. Supergirl's arc is largely about her not having a place, feeling homeless. Obviously, her planet no longer exists, and she's just kind of, out there in the universe on her own. And it kind of engages with that in a bit of a found family aspect. The final note that the film chooses to end on, I don't know necessarily correlates that well with her story in this, but it worked well enough. As someone who doesn't really care for most superhero films, this was a fun enough time. I enjoyed watching it, at least the first half for sure. The second half kind of lost me a little bit, but it wasn't necessarily bad. I gave Supergirl a 3 out of 6.
3 out of 6.